Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Fourth the Scribe podcast. And today I have the immense pleasure, the utmost pleasure of having a very distinguished guest, which I wanted to talk ever since I saw him on his appearances on the debates on Firing Line, which he will probably remember for the best or for the worst. But hello, President of Bard College, Mr.Leon Botstein.
Nice to be here. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
So could you please tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin?
So I'm the president of Bard College, which is a liberal arts college in the United States that has a particular tradition in the arts and the humanities, but it's a full-scale liberal arts college. It's well known in the United States, not only for the quality of its faculty, distinguished faculty, and a long tradition in literature, oddly symbolized by the fact that Philip Roth is buried in our cemetery, and Hannah Arendt was a member of our member of our community. Her husband was a member of the faculty, but has a very distinguished faculty to this day. It has also the largest prison education program in the country. It also has runs 8 early colleges in the United States in 6 cities. These are public colleges where young people of high school age begin college early. From the American point of view. And we also have a distinguished collaboration with Al-Quds on the West Bank. We have an honors college there. We probably have the largest Palestinian-American academic collaboration. And we train teachers on the West Bank too for the Palestinian Authority. And we have this very fine honors college in Abu Dis. And then we have cooperations with 3 high schools in Israel, including one in Lod, where we have a long tradition of helping the teaching of writing and reading, of close reading and writing. So I'm President Bard. I'm by profession a musician. So I was actually music director of the Jerusalem Symphony in Israel from 2003, I think, to 2011. So I spent a lot of time there. And I'm music director of the American Symphony Orchestra and the orchestra now, both American ensembles. And I've done for my recording. And the last thing is that my own academic training is and work is in the history of music. And so I've written on basically the 19th and 20th centuries topics in that period. And so I've sort of had a continuing role in the scholarship, so to speak, of musicology. I'm editor of the Musical Quarterly, which is the oldest, published by Oxford, the oldest scholarly music journal in the United States.
Yes, thank you for that fine introduction. I like it very much when people can speak few words and not use all the kind of elongated and ebb and flow of language to describe things. So I like simple things and objects and facts. But you were born in Zurich, that's correct?
Yes, my parents are Russian-Polish Jews who were excluded from attending medical school in the independent Poland. They emigrated from Russia to Poland at the end of the Russo-Polish War in 1921. And so my parents both had their secondary education in Lodz. And my father went to a Zionist gymnasium, actually, And then they went to Switzerland and they went to medical school. And one thing led to another, and they were luckily caught in the war in Switzerland. And we, the three children, were all born in Switzerland during the war and after the war. I'm the youngest. So, and then eventually my parents emigrated to America.
Yeah, and Zurich had a very fascinating art scene, a very kind of underground, shall we say, escape from the war. Would that be correct in me saying?
I don't know that much about it. My impression is Zurich was very active, as you suggest, during the First World War.
Yes.
During the Second World War, I mean, it was a refuge. There were refugees there, and people trapped, surrounded by Nazi-occupied Europe. But I think when we think of Zurich as a kind of place where James Joyce was, and a kind of as you suggest, a place.
Well, every writer under the sun, basically.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I think my guess is, but this is more than I know. I'm guessing the 20s. Beginning during the war. I mean, Ferruccio Busoni was there during the war, and as you say, everyone and his cousin were there. During the Second World War, I'm not sure how vibrant an intellectual scene or artistic scene it had.
Yeah. So your parents had any type of affinity to arts or music that particularly sparked?
Not really. I think my mother was the whole family was the classic upper middle class, urban, Eastern Central European Jews with very high educational levels. And my grandfather, who was a Russian Jew, and my grandmother was from Moscow, did part of his university work in Germany, as well as, finishing a law degree in Kazan. And part of their education was, what we would call today music appreciation. My mother was a very accomplished amateur pianist. She was a professor of medicine. She was a very distinguished career as a physician. But she loved music, and she took us, really small children, to concerts. So, and we all grew up with the expectation we have to play an instrument. This kind of very, very standard. I think my father played the tuba in the high school band in Lodz. So nothing distinguished, but very respectable. And in my case, coming to America as a very small child, I stuttered and I had difficulty switching languages.
Yes.
And not surprisingly, I sort of gravitated to music as a kind of area of comfort where I wasn't anxious about being able to express myself. Whereas in any language, in the sort of multilingual environment which I grew up, which had, a mixture of languages, because my parents, when we finally came to New York, we grew up in a refugee emigre environment, essentially. 90% of the people we knew had come from the old country, were survivors. And they spoke every manner of language, including a very peculiar English. So charming. And so music became a kind of natural
second skin
of safety for me. So that's where I made the determination I would spend my life with it.
Yes. I know about the Lady of Kazan, the Kazan Cathedral, from the short story by Gogol.
Yes.
The Nose. Yes. That's where I heard.
that's a great, but that's the Kazan Cathedral in Petersburg. But my grandfather went to the same law school that Lenin did. So Lenin went to the University of Kazan as well. Yes.
Mm. So where did you first heard your first composition? What was the scenario? Who you?
What's the first piece of music I remember hearing?
Yes. What was the first piece of music that you heard and you not necessarily recognized, but that moved you to your very core? Shall we say?
I think there's no question that it probably is not the first piece of music I ever heard. But if you ask from my childhood, which piece of music in some way mesmerized me, electrified me, and is representative of my determination to be a musician. And I would say the Brahms Violin Concerto, the D major violin concerto of Johannes Brahms. My parents, we came sponsored by the Hebrew Immigration Service, by Hayas, and they didn't have much money, but at all. And we lived in an apartment house in the Bronx. And I think my mother subscribed to a kind of a Book of the Month Club record outfit. Was a music appreciation outfit, and they sent you once a month a record. And I'm just guessing because I don't remember clearly, that there was this recording of the Brahms Violin Concerto. And I think it was with Yehudi Menuhin and Felix Weingartner. That's an old man he must have been. And the piece has remained for me all my life in a category by itself from an autobiographical point of view.
Yeah, well, you have a deep kind of affinity to music, the German, the Deutsche music of the 18th and 19th century. You can say that Heine and Wagner and the people along those lines who composed the music. Of course, Wagner wasn't a great fan of the, let's say the Jews, essentially. I didn't want to say that, but maybe a particular type of Jewry that was in Deutschland at that time. Do you feel there's a kind of inherent opposition or to what you do? Essentially, people or composers who are not necessarily so friendly to your creed, shall we say?
Oh, I know. I mean, what you're asking is about the relationship between anti-Semitism, right?
Yes.
And the prevalence or persistence of anti-Semitism among composers in Central Europe. From the 17th century to the present. Well, I think my own feeling about this is that I don't approach music from a biographical point of view. Therefore, I don't confuse the music I'm interested in with it as an evidentiary piece of someone's biography. I don't think you can translate biography into work. Biographies are interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about in relationship to people who write novels, poetry, painting, or whatever they do, or write music. But number one. Number two, anti-Semitism is a major constant in European history. and it takes different shapes. And if you want to protect yourself from contact with anti-Semites, you're going to have to give up being a musician. Because it's the exceptions who weren't anti-Semites. So there are exceptions, you know. Shostakovich was an exception. To a great extent, Rachmaninoff was an exception.
Yes.
Stravinsky was not an exception. Even as fine a composer with so many Jewish colleagues, including Kochanski, the violinist, and Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist, Karol Szymanowski had a kind of classic, ordinary Polish anti-Semitic sensibility, which is an embarrassment to read when you read his letters. So Schumann was horrifically anti-Semitic. Brahms was not. But Max Bruch, for example, who wrote Kol Nidre, who was a German Protestant, was also quite decidedly anti-Semitic, despite the fact that he wrote Kol Nidre. So you have to really, if you wanted to purge all of Russian literature of anti-Semites, you'd have very little left.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly, I think, with that sentiment and that approach to academic research. We have to...
Chopin was a terrible anti-Semite. There's no getting around this. That's the nature of the beast.
My favorite composer, I'm sad to say, yes, it wasn't. I think.
But it's not. I think it's something to acknowledge, but it is, and to think about, and not make believe it doesn't exist. But it doesn't prevent one from dealing with the work, and the work. It's hard in music in particular. So I'm doing this weekend, for example, I'm conducting 2 performances of Richard Strauss's Salome. Now, in Salome, there is a scene in which 5 Jews show up to convince King Herod or advise him in how to deal with John the Baptist. Now, what Strauss writes in a very quick meter is a caricature of Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews arguing. 5 contentious rabbis.
Yes.
Having a kind of dispute, splitting hairs.
Based on English.
Yes. For example, about the prophet Elijah. And it's a caricature, it's an anti-Semitic caricature of Eastern European Jews. It's on the stage. It's brilliantly written. It's very effective dramatically. One has to acknowledge what it is, but it doesn't bother me. It doesn't fail to delight me.
Yes.
It's quite amusing in its own way.
Yes. Well, now it's the time of the Purim-Spiel, so it's fine. Everything is open to interpretation once a year. Yeah. Yes. So going back to music and actually playing music, as opposed to composing or theorizing or writing research and papers about music, we'll try to back up and talk about your instrument, which I believe is a violin. That's the first instrument you picked up, yes?
Yeah, it was the instrument that I studied, yes, when I was young. So I think, every musician has a different path, but there are a lot of similarities. So I did, some share of improvising and on the piano and composing. But I don't know why, but I thankfully realized that I neither had the motivation nor the impetus to say anything. What I became interested in early in my life, very early in my life, for reasons I don't fully understand myself, and partly because I grew up in a family of remnants,
yes,
of survivors. So my father was the only survivor in his family. And we grew up knowing that my mother had brothers and uncles and aunts, all who didn't make it. And there wasn't a single person who visited our household in America who either didn't escape the war or suffered during the war and survived. And that's practically all they could talk about. So what was interesting was being a child in a new place where there had been kind of an erasure of the past. The past had been wiped out. I mean, Hitler successfully, it was remarkable success in wiping out the people and culture of East Central Europe and European Jewry.
yes.
So we grew up being aware of that. And I increasingly, exiles and emigres have a way of talking in a kind of nostalgic terms about the world that they left,
Yes.
and from which they had been expelled. And in a child's mind, taking my own childhood, this was a kind of a magical place that didn't exist anymore. And somehow all the bad things about it were sort of wiped out, and you had a kind of sanitized fairy tale. But in this sanitized fairy tale, I discovered there are a lot of people whom the stories being told of the past were designed to remember. People have been forgotten. And one thing led to another, and I found myself, in my eagerness to learn more repertory, in other words, my parents allowed me to stand at the opera during the school week, which I was very glad about. And I went to a lot of concerts. And New York has still a fantastic public music library. And in those days, you could go to the stacks. So on the way of looking for Mozart or looking for Bach or looking for Beethoven, in the stacks, I began to see all this music, all these scores by people whose names I had no idea, whether it was Moshkovsky, Magnard, Martineau. Any.
Also, James Joyce. James Joyce composed a lot of pieces. Yes.
Yeah, but I have never gotten to James Joyce's music. I've done a program on music about James Joyce, including the piece. I just recorded the piece he considered the greatest piece of his time, which is a song cycle of poems by Gottfried Keller called Buried Alive. It's a song cycle for baritone and orchestra. And I just recorded it with Michael Nage, a terrific baritone. In any event, so I discovered all kinds of scores of people whose names I didn't know. And I became interested in how little of the history of music we actually teach, represent, and play. If you're a violinist, you have the same series of concertos. You start with Mozart, then you go Bach, Mozart, Mendelssohn, then you go to, Tchaikovsky, Sibelius.
Saint-Saëns.
Tchaikovsky, it's this ensemble, the same stuff comes up. And I discovered all this music, in a library, that I'd never heard of by people who should be known but aren't known. So I, early in life, got interested in trying to rescue history from oblivion. I did in New York over the past years. I'm interested in the choral repertory. So I did Paul Dessau, German composer, and Max Brod, the friend of Kazan, the translator, did a cantata. Get this, a cantata, a whole evening cantata called Haggadah Shel Pesach, a Passover Haggadah made into a European oratorio. Wow. I did the first American performance at Carnegie Hall, right? Max Bruch of Kol Nidre fame wrote an oratorio called Moses. And I did that. And Ferdinand Hiller did a very famous oratorio, friend of Mendelssohn's, called The Destruction of Jerusalem. And I did that. And so I became, I already as a kid, I became a crusade, the defender of the underdog, if you know what I mean. Because so many snobs and music lovers, right? I don't understand the musical public. They go because they hear not the Beethoven symphonies.
I feel the people that know less about music or the least about music.
No, I don't care what they know about. Yeah, but why do they go every year to listen to the same piece? I don't get it. And when there's a new piece or a piece they don't know, they don't buy a ticket. It's the exact opposite of what they do in a movie. I want to see the new movie. I don't want to see Casablanca again for the 180th time. I don't know how people bear it.
Or Angels with Dirty Faces, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the poor Mahler symphonies are wildly overexposed. They should be put on the shelf for a long time. There's so much more music from the past, let alone new music, that deserves doing. So, but my first instrument, to answer your question more simply, was the violin, yes.
Okay, thank you. That was a great answer, and I couldn't ask for a better one. Yeah. So, just let me focus for a second. What are we talking about? Yes. You talked about trying to actually save those pieces of music from oblivion, from the backlogs of history, and not even that. They will disappear from the shelves, the backlogs, in due time. But I saw a painting, which I didn't know if it was a copy or an original, in the Tel Aviv University Library. One of the main libraries, one of the big ones. And I had no idea. I tried to check in the catalogs. I tried to call the office administrators or even bring someone who is an expert from the faculty. It was a great painting, a portrait, a very imperialist portrait. And I don't know if it's a copy, but if it's a copy, it's a good one. But it's in bad shape, really bad condition. It was
who is the portrait of? Who is the portrait of?
It was I will tell you right now. It was a portrait of Simon Bolivar.
Oh yes,
the great, first Bolivian, shall we say? Yeah. But I didn't know what to do with that, so I want to ask you: how can you revive works from times past, and how do you recontextualize them in the present?
Well, it's a good question. So we've done a lot of it. I've done a lot of it. The first thing is you have to choose the works reasonably carefully, and you have to come up with a way of presenting them. And if if you believe in them, right, then it requires playing them more than once, but also, as you suggest, putting them in a context. And eventually you get the trust of the audience. So in the United States, I've been doing this for a long time, in New York, at Carnegie Hall, and in other venues. And the audience comes with a certain trust. You know, I did The Apostles as an oratorio by Edward Elgar. Hadn't been done in New York for over 100 years, but the place was packed. We did a stage performance during a summer festival, fully staged, of Meyerbeer's Huguenot, a fantastic opera, the most often played piece in the repertoire of the Paris Opera in the 19th century. A fantastic piece, if you open up the cuts and make it a dramatic piece. And so the audience learns that they're going to encounter something new, but something they can relate to and like and respond to, and it'll be exciting. In a festival on the music of Rimsky-Korsakov, I did a fantastic symphony by Sergei Taneyev, who was the teacher of Rachmaninoff, and a wonderful composer who has a wonderful opera, the Oresteia setting of Aeschylus. So if the music is good and you do it persuasively, and often you sort of pull the audience in by placing, if you program intelligently, it's thematic. So during the beginning of the Beethoven year, before the pandemic, we did a concert in New York, which was Beethoven and his contemporaries. So the program ended with the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven, which people love to hear. But there was a piano concerto by Ferdinand Ries. There was a piece by Anton Reicha. There was a piece by Cherubini. And so stuff that, and the audience loved all of that stuff. And they'll come back for more. So I actually trust the audience that it is more curious than managers or administrators or even artists think.
Yeah, I'll tell you the truth. If I wanted to see an opera and I would see, you know, the tickets up to the shows, what's in the lineup, like they say in stand-up comedy, and if I will see like an interesting, you know, phrase or name or something exotic, I must admit I fall for those types. I'm not a type of Orientalist or something like this. I'm not drawn to the, but it's something, you know, that in a Western context, it's very odd. It's out of place. But I wanted us to actually talk about those types of sentiments and feelings that that a new piece of music can have on a person, and why is music even important? I think because you will be shocked to hear or not that I know people personally who cannot stand music. They can't hear it. And I don't know how such a person is still alive and breathing.
I think most humans are on some level musical, all of them. People have different affinities to music. People such as the ones you describe, I think they do exist. There are people who have difficulty with acoustical environment to begin with, what I would call the acoustic environment. People are really undone by noise and by made very anxious by noise and so. And I'm extremely eclectic in my taste. Yeah. So people, you know, there's hardly one kind of music, and most people have some kind of affinity to music. I happen to think music is a way of life. It is probably, to me, the most human, more than language, the most human mode of expression of being in the world. And because it has an indeterminate meaning, it has meaning within the system of the use of sound, whether it be Chinese music or Indian music or Western music. There is some kind of system and convention and ritual, and people abide by. But each of those circumstances, it's a form of communication that is not dependent on language and can't be easily translated into language and or pictures. At the same time, it seems to have some real meaning to people.
Yes.
I think it has a real meaning.
If you look at a Kandinsky painting, and he titles all of his paintings composition number 1, number 2, what he tells you.
I think, yeah. So as you know, Kandinsky, had this notion of what we call non-objective art that is formal and not connected to any realist conception or realist illusion. And he was, of course, he wrote an opera himself called, I've actually heard it done, called The Orange Sound, Yellow Sound, Orange, something like that. And so he did believe painting in the non-objective sense. It's not abstract, it's one step beyond abstract, because abstraction is about
it's conceptual, yes.
But also it's a dealing with the way we perceive the external world. This is simply about color, shape, and space, and line. And so I think it was an effort on Kandinsky's part for the visual to attain the kind of independence he associated with music. And as you know, he had a friendship with Schoenberg, who was a painter who tried his hand at painting. And Schoenberg was I think, relatively persuaded that music was a self-referential system of rules and meaning. And so I think this impulse is human. Mendelssohn used to argue, not used to, but argued once in a letter that music was clearer and more precise than language.
You mean Felix or Moses Mendelssohn?
Felix.
Yes.
And so I think music is a fundamental way of life. It's a form of life that it reminds us of what we're capable of. Every time I open a score or I begin a rehearsal, or I'm in awe of the gift that we have to invent something that's wholly imaginary. It's not found in nature. There's no imitation of nature. Kind of music that I'm interested in. But it's sort of the last language. Someone can steal language from you. You can talk a string of cliches, which are simply borrowed phrases from the TV, the internet, your parents, what you read. So you can be a kind of assemblage of other people's mode of speaking. And that will influence, your assemblage as a mode of thinking as well. Music is a little different. There are a lot of composers.
Okay, so let's expand that idea and try to cast it over all of the different arts. The idea that art has a type of meaning, a kind of message it wants to convey to the listener or the listener or the.
I'm not. I think I don't. I'm reluctant to think that there's any message.
Mm-hmm.
I think what music does in the best instance, and we're talking about music that doesn't have a narrative. It's not an opera, not a movie score, not a video game score.
Instrumental.
And it doesn't have a literary program. So it's not Mazeppa by Liszt or, I don't know, Also Sprach Zarathustra by Strauss. There's not, we don't have a literary or a visual program of some kind. So it's instrumental music. It can be the 24 preludes and fugues of your J.S. Bach, but whatever you want. No one can deny that there is some formal meaning. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Things relate to one another. It has a grammar, rhetoric. It's a complete form of human expression.
Okay, let me reframe my question and speak to the social aspect or the human aspect of art.
The social art, I can't. That's too big for me. But in music,
no, I'm just trying to. Okay, let's focus on music.
So let's take music. In music, the social aspect is that music is a form of human communication for us as social beings. Yes. So either we do it in the home, so we can play for ourselves, we can play with other people, with duets, chamber music, and all that. And then there's a public, theatrical aspect. We're recitalists, we're violinists, we're cellists. We have a public, and that's a different thing. Their music is quite remarkable because it's a public art form that eludes the eyes of the censor. In other words, if you do theater, if I'm Putin and I want to arrest everybody who's against the war in the Ukraine, right? In Ukraine, not the Ukraine, in Ukraine. In Ukraine, if I want to arrest all my opponents, and I go to a play, and the play is about a crazy guy who invades a country, and I can really see that play as being treasonous, and I can shut the play down, and I can have the people arrested, right? If I go to a painting, an exhibition of paintings, and they're caricatures of me as a killer and murderer, and they're, a kind of Guernica representation of Putin as the neo-Hitler. Okay, I can have those people arrested and sent to prison. But if I hear a symphony called Symphony Number 7, right? I don't know what the composer is saying. For all I know, it could be treasonous, but it would be very hard to find out. What I'm saying is Beethoven once told his friend, Franz Grillparzer, the Austrian playwright, that he envied him. Grillparzer told Beethoven that he envied Beethoven, and Grillparzer and Beethoven said, why? He said, because when I submit my work to the censor, they know what they're looking for. When you submit your work to the censor, they don't have a clue what's going on. And that has to do with also me as a listener. I can sit next to the head of the KGB, right? Or the FSB. I'm sitting next to the head of the FSB, right?
That's better.
Something happens on the stage. If I laugh or cry, the FSB agent can't connect my laughter and what happened on the stage, or my crying, what happened on the stage. It's not like a play or a movie, right? So in the movie about Scottish independence that I think came out years ago called Braveheart, where
Sir William Wallace.
That's our William. So everybody cheers, right? So they know the FSB agent knows all these people are partisans for Scottish independence, right? But I don't know if I cheer at the end of the Fifth Symphony of Shostakovich, I don't even know whose side I'm on. Am I Stalin's side, or I'm on the oppressed people's side? So music allows. So if I go to a kind of a romantic Chopin nocturne, right, and I'm sitting with my wife, right, and I'm daydreaming in this romantic way. I mean, and my wife is daydreaming. So is she daydreaming about me, or is she daydreaming about somebody else? You know, it's both public and private. That's the great thing about music listening. You can have the wonderful event of a community. It's fantastic to be in an audience, you know, and see the curtain go down. You know, I once of a great piece. I'm thinking of The Dwarf, an opera by Zemlinsky, by Alexander von Zemlinsky. And it's a fantastic ending, you know, it's a real dramatic ending. And the audience leaps to its feet, right? Because the piece is so exciting and so well paced, and it ends brilliantly. Now, when it does so, we don't know why they're at it. So there's still a community, but there's privacy. Music is an unusual reconciliation of the public and the private.
Wow, that is a wonderful definition. It also echoes some of the neopolitics in this day and age, I feel. Pardon me. You know, the political is the personal and the personal is the political, and you can't escape that Ouroboros snake, yes, that eats its own tail.
No, I mean, look, we're recording this during the war on Ukraine, right?
Yes.
So for artists to say...
It's not a war, it's an Anschluss.
No, who knows what it is? It's... you can't get away. You can't get away from assuming responsibility as a citizen, and especially if you're going to perform in public. You can't simply say, music has nothing to do with politics. That's not true. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make music political, but music is a public act in the public realm, and it has political consequences. So if I play Beethoven 9 on Hitler's birthday, that says something. If I play Beethoven 9 when the Berlin Wall falls, it means something else.
Yes.
Okay.
Leonard Bernstein doesn't endorse Hitler in any way.
He doesn't. Although Leonard Bernstein was too nice to old Nazis, from my point of view. But let's go back to the war on Ukraine. So if you want to have an international career, you don't want to only play for Russians, and you're a Russian artist, you have a very few choices. You can remain in Russia and support the regime. In a way, I respect those people. I don't like those people, but I respect those people. Say, I am a Russian patriot, just the way, you know, against the criticism of a great part of the world, Israeli citizens and Israeli artists will defend a military action by Israel, right? And they're proud of it. So there's some Russians who believe this is right, and Putin is right, and it's a vote for the greater glory of Russia. I respect those people, but those people can't expect to play in London or in New York. Then there's the second. There's the poor Russian artist who really doesn't agree, but is not a hero, doesn't want to go to jail, doesn't eventually really look forward to being shot. I saw a wonderful interview with a journalist who had opposed the war in Ukraine, and she said, you know, I really don't want to go to jail, but I have my bags packed. It reminds me of the stories during Stalin, the purges, when writers had their bags packed, waiting to be arrested. So it seems to me that
Yes.
those people can do what people have called inner emigration. They can fall silent. What they do is they get out of the limelight. There are several German artists, Karl Amadeus Hartmann, for example, composer, wonderful composer, non-Jewish. He was a virulent anti-Nazi. He spent the entire war years in Germany, but in obscurity. He hid under the desk, something we call inner emigration. And I respect those people. It's impossible to ask people to emigrate, to uproot themselves, or to, give themselves over to being arrested. That's more than we need to expect. And then there's the third, is the person who says, I don't agree, and I'm willing to suffer the consequences, but I'm going to emigrate. I'm going to leave the country till it changes. And you have those three choices. And I don't envy the Russian artists, because most of them aren't Gergiev. They don't have big positions. They're barely making a living. And I respect those who genuinely take the path of inner emigration.
Mm. Yes. Would it be fair to say before, one of the reasons that I've called upon you and not anyone else, at least not for now, or today specifically, is because I thought about, we need to support the moderate way, because, aggressiveness and violence and hatred is, I think, non-acceptable in the post Holocaust world, I think. And I think you'll agree with me, maybe, or maybe not, that you will take the path of a libertarian, or at least a classically liberal person whenever you encounter the opportunity or it arises.
Well, I mean, you mean liberal, not libertarian. You mean liberal?
Yes.
Yeah, liberal. Yeah,
classically liberal.
Yes. Liberal. Yeah, I probably. Yeah, I would guess it classically liberal. I believe in academic freedom as a basic right, and the right to dissent. I'm not. I'm extremely suspicious and hostile to efforts to restrict speech. I find the intolerance of disagreement very difficult to bear. And I don't confuse dissent with offense. If you say something I don't agree with, I don't take it personally. I don't actually. So I do. Words really matter, and ideas matter, in my view. And there's no hope for democracy, in my view, unless people are able to agree to disagree. And one of the things they have to agree and disagree about is simply matters. Now, it's sad to say, matters of fact. In other words, whether or not, take the Ukraine war. How many Russian soldiers are there? How many have died? And how many civilians were hit? And we need to agree that absence real proof, you can't operate on a conspiracy theory.
Yes.
That the people who support the war on Ukraine, the Russian side, believe in elaborate conspiracy theories, and that Zelensky is, NATO agent, and this was all a scheme to destroy Russia. This talk in Russia is very similar to the talk after the First World War in Germany, that we were stabbed in the back, we lost the First World War, we were humiliated, and that's what makes him dangerous, because he does have popular support.
Yes.
So
Well,
I am a liberal in the belief that politics requires the replacement of violence by words.
yes. And of course, a peaceful exchange of government.
Yes.
Okay, I want to thank you so much, President
Thank you very much.
Botstein.
And
This has been a pleasure, and I wish you all the best.
And good luck to you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.